In 1934, a decorated American general walked into Congress and quietly testified that some of the richest men in the United States had tried to hire him to overthrow the government and install a fascist dictatorship. This was not a movie plot. This was sworn testimony in the United States Capitol, recorded in official documents and buried in the archives for decades. Imagine this. You wake up one day and discover that the only reason your country did not become a fascist state is because one man said no. Not the president, not the Supreme Court, not the press. A single retired general. That is not a metaphor. That is what may have happened in the United States in the early 1930s, at the height of the Great Depression, when a group of powerful bankers and industrialists allegedly tried to recruit a war hero to lead a private army of 500,000 veterans to Washington. The man they chose was Major General Smedley Butler of the United States Marine Corps, retired. At that moment, he was the most decorated Marine in American history, a two-time Medal of Honor recipient, a legend among rank and file soldiers, and a household name across the country. If you wanted to stage a march on the Capitol and wrap it in a flag, you would want a man like that at the front. On November 20th, 1934, Butler walked into a hearing room in Washington. It was not a grand courtroom in a movie. It was a regular committee room in the House Office Building, with bad lighting, wooden chairs, and the bored energy of bureaucrats who had already heard too many speeches. The Special Committee on Un-American Activities, chaired by Congressman John McCormick and Samuel Dickstein, sat in front of him, expecting the usual warnings about communist agitation or labor unrest. Instead, they got a bomb. Under oath, Butler calmly described a plot in which wealthy businessmen linked to major corporations and financial institutions had approached him with a proposal. They wanted him to organize and lead an army of 500,000 World War I veterans, funded with millions of dollars from Wall Street, to pressure or overthrow President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Their goal, he said, was to replace real democratic government with a controlled regime modeled on the rising fascist states of Europe. To understand why this was so explosive, you need to know who Smedley Butler was when he sat in that chair. He was not a fringe figure. He was not a failed officer or a bitter crank. He was the man newspapers had once called the ideal American soldier. Born in 1881 in a politically connected Pennsylvania family, he had dropped out of school at 16 to join the Marines during the Spanish-American War. Over the next 3 decades, he fought in a long list of American interventions: the Philippines, the Boxer Rebellion in China, Central America, the Caribbean, and World War I. He earned the Medal of Honor twice, once for his actions at Veracruz, Mexico in 1914, and once in Haiti in 1915, when he led Marines against heavily defended positions. Few Americans in uniform had that kind of record. Veterans knew his name. They listened when he spoke. He also had a reputation for being almost painfully direct. In the 1920s, when Philadelphia was drowning in corruption, the city asked Butler to serve as director of public safety. He treated the role like a military campaign, raiding speakeasies, going after corrupt officers, and even targeting elite clubs that assumed they were off limits. He made so many enemies among powerful people that he was eventually pushed out. But to ordinary citizens and veterans, this only strengthened his image as a man who would not sell out. By 1931, Butler retired from the Marines with the rank of Major General. He could have spent the rest of his life giving speeches at banquets, and endorsing products. But he did something very different. He began speaking openly about how American corporations had used the military as a tool to protect their investments overseas. In public lectures and interviews, he described himself as having been a racketeer for big business, listing countries where he had helped secure profits for banks and companies. That kind of brutal honesty was rare, and it made him dangerous to people who preferred quiet. He also stood with veterans when they clashed with the government. In 1932, thousands of desperate World War I veterans, known as the Bonus Army, marched on Washington to demand early payment of promised bonuses. They set up camps in and around the Capitol. Butler visited them, ate with them, and told them they had the right to demand what they were owed. When the government eventually sent in troops under General Douglas MacArthur to clear the camps with cavalry, tanks, and gas, Butler was not on the side of the men in uniform. He was on the side of the veterans in the mud. All of this made him uniquely dangerous to anyone planning a coup. He had the respect of veterans. He had name recognition. He had a record of obeying orders in combat and defying political pressure outside of it. He was the perfect figurehead for a movement that needed legitimacy. According to Butler, the first approach came in 1933 through a man named Gerald McGuire. McGuire was a bond salesman connected to a firm associated with a director who sat on the boards of major companies like Goodyear and Bethlehem Steel, and he had ties to J.P. Morgan interests. On paper, he was just a financial middleman, but he told Butler that he represented extremely wealthy clients who were terrified of what Franklin Roosevelt was doing to the American economic system. At first, McGuire did not talk about a coup. He talked about a speech. He suggested that Butler attend the National Convention of the American Legion, the largest veterans organization in the country, and use his influence to steer the group in a more conservative direction. McGuire wanted Butler to push the Legion to oppose Roosevelt's decision to abandon the gold standard. He offered to cover all expenses and hinted at more support. Butler found this suspicious. Why would bond salesmen and anonymous backers care so much about a speech by a retired general to a veterans convention? Why were they willing to pay? It did not add up. But instead of walking away, he did something else. He listened. Over the next year, McGuire kept coming back. Each visit, according to Butler's later testimony, went one step further. The conversation moved from speeches about currency to organizing veterans on a national scale. McGuire bragged about extensive travel in Europe, where he had studied how groups like the French Croix de Feu and the German and Italian veterans organizations operated. The message beneath his stories was clear. In Europe, veterans were not just a pressure group. They were the backbone of fascist movements. At some point in 1934, the mask came off. In a meeting at Butler's home in Pennsylvania, McGuire laid out a plan that sounded like a blueprint for an American version of the March on Rome. The idea, as Butler recounted it, was to create a national organization of veterans under a respectable name, something that sounded patriotic and moderate. One label that appeared in related documents was the Committee for a Sound Dollar and Sound Currency, a group that had already issued statements aligned with conservative business interests. Behind the scenes, this would be the framework for a force of 500,000 men. McGuire told Butler they could easily recruit that many veterans who were disillusioned with Roosevelt and afraid of economic chaos. They would be organized, equipped, and ready to move if called. Funding, McGuire said, would not be a problem. He spoke of $2 or $3 million immediately available and much more if needed. To weapons manufacturers and chemical giants that saw the New Deal as a threat, this was an investment, not an expense. The objective, as Butler described it, was not necessarily to shoot the president or fly a flag over the White House overnight. It was more subtle and, in some ways, more chilling. The plan was to use the threat of a massive armed march on Washington, combined with Roosevelt's real health problems and political vulnerabilities, to force him to accept a new position in his own government. They would create an office with a reassuring name, something like Secretary of General Affairs. Officially, this person would help manage the expanding bureaucracy and relieve the burden on the president. In practice, this new official would control the key levers of power: the budget, the armed forces, major appointments. Roosevelt would remain as a symbol, a man in a wheelchair smiling for the cameras. The real authority would belong to the unelected strongman behind him. This is what early European fascism looked like in practice. When Mussolini marched on Rome in 1922, he did not abolish the monarchy. He took power under a legal veneer and then dismantled democracy from within. What Butler heard in his living room in 1934 sounded very much like a proposal to copy that model on American soil. Butler asked blunt questions. Who exactly was behind this? Who had promised the money? Who would supply the weapons? McGuire did not give a neat list of names, but he referred to financial sponsors linked to major industrial and banking families. And he made references to firms like Remington that could arm a private force without questions. When Butler pressed, McGuire emphasized that these were men of influence, men whose names were on factories, banks, and political donations across the country. For a moment, stop and sit with the stakes here. A retired general, admired by hundreds of thousands of veterans, is being told that he could effectively become the American equivalent of a fascist leader. He is offered money, an army, and the backing of people who can buy headlines and shape public opinion. He is told that the president is weak, that the country is in danger, that only decisive action can save it. This is the classic story used by authoritarian movements everywhere. Butler did not accept. Instead, he chose a path that turned him into a threat to the very men who had hoped to use him. He began documenting everything. After meetings, he wrote down what McGuire had said, including the details that sounded too wild to be true. He confided in Paul Comley French, a journalist who began his own investigation, interviewing McGuire and confirming key elements of the story. Butler gathered enough that he believed he could not stay silent. In 1934, he approached members of Congress and pushed for an investigation. At first, there was resistance. The implications were terrifying. If Butler was telling the truth, then elements of the economic elite had crossed from lobbying and political pressure into planning outright treason. If he was lying, then a national hero had become a dangerous source of destabilizing conspiracy theories. Reluctantly, the House created a special committee to look into his claims. That is how Butler ended up in that hearing room on November 20th. When he began speaking, the reporters present knew it was unusual, but many still assumed it would be another story about radical agitators or foreign influence. What they heard instead was an accusation that a fascist dictatorship had been plotted in the United States backed by men connected to some of the largest companies in the country. Some journalists took it seriously. Others treated it as absurd on its face. After all, it was easy, even comforting, to believe that such things only happened in unstable countries, in places with weak institutions and no tradition of democracy. But at that moment, Adolf Hitler had already taken power in Germany. Mussolini had ruled Italy for over a decade, and authoritarian movements were spreading through Europe. The idea that American elites might copy those methods was not as far-fetched as it sounded to readers who wanted to believe that it cannot happen here. As Butler finished his testimony, he did not know what parts of his story would be believed, what evidence would be confirmed, or how far the investigation would go. He had done what many officers would never dare. He had publicly accused powerful economic interests of trying to subvert the Constitution. He had put his reputation on the line, knowing that newspapers flooded with corporate advertising money could ridicule him into irrelevance. He walked out of that room expecting that there would be consequences. He believed there would be more hearings, subpoenas, maybe even charges. He had exposed a plot. He assumed the system would act. What actually happened, and what the investigators quietly admitted in their final report, while avoiding any real punishment for those involved, is a story that says as much about power in America as the plot itself. But before that, to understand why anyone would be desperate enough to risk a coup, you need to understand what Franklin Roosevelt was doing to the old order, and why some of the richest men in the country saw him not as a politician, but as an existential threat. March 4, 1933. Franklin Delano Roosevelt takes the oath of office and tells a nation on its knees that the only thing they have to fear is fear itself. It is a beautiful line, and it gives millions of people hope. But in the rooms where the real money lives, a different emotion is spreading. Not fear, rage. Because by March 1933, America is dying. 1 in 4 workers has no job. Over 12 million people are unemployed. Wages for those lucky enough to still have work have collapsed by more than 40% in just 4 years. Farmers are losing their land. Banks are closing. Families are going hungry. This is not a recession. This is the collapse of an economic system, and it happened on the watch of men who claimed they knew how markets worked. Wall Street bankers, industrial magnates, the men who built empires on steel and chemicals and railroads are watching their world burn. But they are not afraid of the Depression itself. They are afraid of what comes after it. They are afraid of Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt does not look like a revolutionary. He is from old money, educated at the best schools, a cousin of Theodore Roosevelt. But within his first 100 days in office, he does something that terrifies the American elite more than any socialist speech or labor march ever could. He uses the power of the federal government to regulate them. In June 1933, Roosevelt signs the Banking Act, also known as Glass-Steagall. It does something Wall Street thought was unthinkable. It separates commercial banking from investment banking. In plain English, this means that the banks that take ordinary people's deposits and make loans can no longer gamble that money in securities markets. Investment banks that deal in stocks and bonds cannot control or overlap with commercial banks. For decades, bankers had enjoyed the freedom to use depositors' money to speculate, to underwrite risky securities, to profit from both sides of the market. When those bets paid off, they kept the profits. When they failed, depositors lost everything, and the economy collapsed. Glass-Steagall ends that game. The law also creates federal deposit insurance, protecting ordinary savers, but putting banks under government supervision. To the men who had built fortunes by controlling both commercial and investment banking, this is not regulation. This is theft of their business model. Roosevelt does not stop there. The National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933 goes even further. It creates the National Recovery Administration, which sets codes for industries covering minimum wages, maximum working hours, and, most explosively, the right of workers to organize unions and bargain collectively. Section 7A of the law explicitly protects the right of employees to join labor unions without interference from employers. To a factory owner or mine operator who has spent years breaking strikes, blacklisting union organizers, and paying workers as little as the market would bear, this is not reform. This is the government taking the side of labor against capital. It is a direct threat to their control over wages, hours, and workplace conditions. Then, in 1934, comes the Securities Exchange Act. This law creates the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, and gives it the power to regulate stock markets and punish fraud. The era of insider trading, stock manipulation, and rigged markets, the very practices that made men like J.P. Morgan untouchable, is suddenly illegal and enforceable. These are not abstract policy debates. Every single one of these laws costs specific, named men real money and real power. Consider the DuPont family. For generations, they controlled a chemical and industrial empire built on explosives, textiles, and later automobiles through their ownership stake in General Motors. They were among the wealthiest families in the United States, and they believed wealth was the natural result of talent and hard work. The idea that the government should redistribute that wealth, regulate how they ran their businesses, or empower their workers to demand more, was, to them, socialism. Irénée Dupont, the former president of the DuPont Company, was open about his hatred of Roosevelt's policies. In an interview in October 1934, he declared that the federal government's methods of spending other people's money for relief were in direct violation of the Constitution. He was not talking about abstract principles. He was talking about his money. The New Deal raised taxes on high incomes and corporations to pay for relief programs and public works. To someone like Dupont, this was not charity. It was confiscation. By August 1934, Dupont and others like him decided that speeches and editorials were not enough. They formed the American Liberty League, an organization explicitly created to oppose Roosevelt and the New Deal. The League was funded primarily by DuPont money and supported by some of the most powerful industrialists and financiers in the country, including executives from General Motors, the Sun Oil Company, and various banking interests tied to J.P. Morgan. On paper, the Liberty League claimed to defend the Constitution and individual liberty. In practice, it was a lobbying and propaganda machine designed to turn public opinion against Roosevelt, block further New Deal legislation, and, if possible, repeal what had already been passed. They spent over $1 million, an enormous sum in Depression-era America, on pamphlets, radio broadcasts, and public campaigns painting Roosevelt as a dictator and his policies as unconstitutional overreach. But by late 1934, it was clear that the Liberty League was not working. Roosevelt remained wildly popular with ordinary voters. The Democratic Party controlled Congress. Labor unions were growing stronger. The regulations were staying in place. Speeches and money were not enough to stop what was happening. Some members of the business elite, began to think in darker terms. If the democratic process would not stop Roosevelt, perhaps something else would. This is where the story turns from political opposition into conspiracy. Because at the same moment that the Liberty League was failing to win over the public, a small group of men, some with ties to those same industrial and banking interests, were exploring a much more direct option. They looked at Europe and saw models that seemed to work. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had taken power in 1922, not through a democratic election, but through the threat of force. He organized disaffected war veterans, armed them, and marched on Rome. The Italian government, fearing civil war, allowed Mussolini to take control. He kept the appearance of the old system. The king remained on his throne, but real power shifted to Mussolini and the Fascist Party. Democracy was dismantled from within. Business leaders who cooperated prospered. Labor unions were crushed. In Germany, Adolf Hitler had just consolidated power after becoming chancellor in 1933. He used a combination of legal maneuvering, street violence by paramilitary groups, and the cooperation of conservative elites who thought they could control him. By 1934, Hitler was purging his enemies and building a dictatorship. Again, the business elite largely supported him because he promised to destroy communism, break the unions, and restore order, which in practice meant restoring their dominance. To some American industrialists watching this from across the Atlantic, these were not horror stories. They were blueprints. The question was not whether a similar approach could work in the United States. The question was how to implement it without triggering a civil war or complete social collapse. You could not simply march on Washington with armed brown shirts and expect the U.S. military to stand aside. You needed legitimacy. You needed a figure the public and the military would respect. You needed someone who could sell the idea that this was not a coup, but a rescue. That is why they needed Smedley Butler. Butler was not just famous. He was beloved by hundreds of thousands of veterans. He had spent years criticizing the government for abandoning soldiers after the war. He spoke their language. If Butler stood at the front of a mass movement of veterans demanding action, millions of Americans would see it not as a corporate power grab, but as patriots saving the country from a president who had overstepped. The men who approached Butler understood that the key to a successful authoritarian takeover in a democratic society is not violence. It is the illusion of necessity. You convince people that democracy has failed, that the leader is weak or dangerous, and that only extraordinary measures can restore order. Then you let them beg you to take power. This was not a fringe conspiracy hatched by marginal figures in a basement. According to Butler's testimony and the investigation that followed, the people behind this were connected to some of the largest financial and industrial entities in the country. The money, the weapons, the organizational structure, all of it was available if Butler agreed to play his role. But there was one thing they did not anticipate. Butler hated them. By 1933, Butler had spent years reflecting on his own career. He had fought in wars across Latin America and the Caribbean, wars that secured profits for American companies, but meant nothing to the people who lived there. In speeches after his retirement, Butler openly described himself as a racketeer for capitalism, a man who spent 3 decades making the world safe for corporate interests. He was not proud of it anymore. When Gerald McGuire came to him with talk of organizing veterans and saving the country from Roosevelt, Butler immediately understood what was really being offered. This was not patriotism. This was the same people who had sent him to fight for their investments, now asking him to overthrow a democratically elected government for their profits. Butler said no. But more than that, he gathered evidence. He involved a journalist to independently verify the story, and he went to Congress. In doing so, he forced the business elite into a position they had not prepared for. They had assumed that their wealth, their connections, and their control over media and political institutions would protect them. They assumed no one would believe a conspiracy this large. They assumed wrong. But even though Butler exposed the plot, even though he testified under oath and a congressional committee confirmed that an attempt to establish a fascist dictatorship had been made, the men behind it were never arrested. Their names were largely kept out of the final report. No trials, no convictions, no consequences. Why? Because in 1934 America, just as today, there is a line that separates people who go to jail for crimes and people who are too connected to touch. Roosevelt and his allies understood that prosecuting some of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the country could destabilize the economy even further, provoke a backlash from the business community, and create a public spectacle that might do more harm than good. So the investigation was quietly concluded. The committee acknowledged in its final report that there had been an attempt, but it stopped short of naming names or recommending prosecutions. The plot was buried in the archives, dismissed by much of the press as exaggeration or paranoia, and slowly faded from public memory. But the hatred did not fade. The business elite who wanted Roosevelt gone in 1933 and 1934 continued to oppose him for the rest of the decade. Some of them, companies like DuPont, General Motors, and others, would later face accusations of doing business with Nazi Germany even after the United States entered World War II. The same people who saw fascism as a solution to American labor problems had no moral issue profiting from fascism abroad. The story of the business plot is not just about one failed conspiracy. It is about what happens when the people who control the economy decide that democracy is an obstacle. It is about how close the United States came to following the same path as Italy and Germany. And it is about the fact that the only thing standing between that outcome and the survival of American democracy was one man who decided to say no. By the summer of 1933, the anger of America's business elite had moved from private complaints in boardrooms to quiet experiments in political warfare. Speeches and lobbying had not stopped Roosevelt. Elections had not stopped Roosevelt. Now a smaller, more determined group was ready to try something else. And for that, they needed one thing they did not have: a soldier the public would trust. They needed Smedley Butler. Gerald McGuire did not walk into Butler's life looking like a villain. He was not a general, not a senator, not a famous tycoon. He was a bond salesman, a middleman in a tailored suit, working for a firm tied into the huge web of J.P. Morgan banking interests. On paper, just another financial operator. In reality, the messenger for people who did not want their names anywhere near what was about to be proposed. McGuire's first approach was cautious. He came to Butler as if he were offering a normal political job. The pitch sounded safe, almost boring. There was a coming American Legion convention. The Legion was the largest veterans organization in the country, and its rank and file admired Butler. McGuire wanted Butler to go there, give a speech, and help steer the Legion in a responsible direction. Responsible, in this case, meant pro-business and anti-Roosevelt. He offered to pay for everything: travel, hotel, expenses. He talked about a prepared speech that criticized Roosevelt's decision to take the United States off the gold standard. On the surface, it was about currency policy. In reality, it was about power. Staying on the gold standard protected creditors and big banks. Leaving it gave Roosevelt flexibility to manage the economy and help debtors. If Butler could get the Legion to publicly attack Roosevelt on this, it would look like veterans, not bankers, were leading the charge. Butler's instincts immediately told him something was wrong. He had spent too long in the shadows of foreign interventions not to recognize when someone was running a covert operation. He wanted to know who was behind McGuire, who was paying, who would benefit. McGuire dodged the questions, talked about friends, backers, patriotic businessmen who preferred to remain in the background. Most men in Butler's position would have simply refused and closed the door. Butler did something more dangerous. He decided to listen carefully and remember everything. Over the next months, McGuire kept coming back. Each time he pushed a little further. The money he talked about got bigger. The plans got more ambitious. And slowly, the mask came off. He bragged about trips to Europe. He spoke about studying how veterans' organizations worked in France and Italy, how war veterans there were organized, disciplined, uniformed, and ready to move when called, how they had become the backbone of political movements. He was not shy about his admiration. In Italy, he said, things were under control. There was order. No strikes, no chaos, no Bolshevik agitation. The implication was clear. Fascism worked, at least for people who owned factories and banks. At one point, he told Butler almost casually that in Italy, big industrialists paid off Mussolini's squads to keep the workers in line. He described it as if it were just another business expense, no different from advertising or shipping costs. The message to Butler was simple. This is how serious men handle disorder. Then came the real offer. In the summer of 1934, McGuire arrived at Butler's home in Newtown Square with a plan that was no longer about speeches or resolutions. It was about force, not open civil war, something that looked, on the surface, like a peaceful movement of veterans. But at its core, it was a threat of organized, armed pressure on the government. The idea was to build a new national veterans organization that would dwarf the American Legion. On paper, it would be about sound money, patriotism, and restoring confidence, the kind of slogans that look harmless on a pamphlet. Behind the scenes, it would be an army. 500,000 men. That was the number McGuire used. 500,000 trained veterans, organized in units, with officers, uniforms, and equipment. Veterans who had been betrayed in 1932, when the bonus army was driven out of Washington by tanks and gas. Veterans who trusted Butler because he had stood with them in their camps, not with the officers who burned their shelters. And who would lead this army? McGuire did not hesitate. It had to be Butler. The logic was brutal and simple. Ordinary Americans would never accept a private army marching on Washington under the command of some unknown financier or openly fascist agitator. They might accept it under a man they saw as a hero, a man who had bled for the country and never played politics. Butler's name and face were the camouflage that would make an anti-democratic movement look patriotic. To sweeten the offer, McGuire talked about money. There would be an initial fund of $2 or $3 million to get the organization off the ground. There were promises of much more if needed. For the men behind the scenes, this was not a cost. It was an investment. 500,000 disciplined, loyal veterans under a trusted general were worth far more than any advertising campaign or lobbying effort. Butler pressed him on the practical questions. Where would the weapons come from? How would they explain this to the public? What was the end game? McGuire had answers. For weapons and equipment, he pointed to friendly arms manufacturers, corporations that would gladly sell or even lend rifles, ammunition, and gear under the cover of some patriotic program. They already produced weapons for foreign governments and police forces. Selling to a large security organization at home would not raise alarms if handled correctly. For public relations, the story was already half-written. The country, they would say, was in chaos. Roosevelt's policies had failed. The currency was unstable. Communists and radicals were infiltrating unions and government. The veterans once again would be called on to save the nation, just as they had in 1917. Their march on Washington would be presented not as a coup, but as a rescue mission. The end game was the most sinister part. McGuire explained that there was no need to storm the White House or hang anyone from lampposts. That kind of drama was for unstable countries. America, he said, needed something cleaner. The plan, as Butler later described it, was to use the presence of this huge, loyal force as leverage. Under the pressure of an armed, disciplined army around the capital, Roosevelt would be persuaded to delegate his authority. He would remain as president, but a new, powerful position would be created above him in everything but name. A Secretary of General Affairs, or some similar title, a man who would run the country in the president's name. In front of the cameras, nothing would seem to have changed. The flag would still fly, Congress would still meet, the Supreme Court would still deliver opinions, elections would still happen. But real power, the power to decide budgets, direct the military, control law enforcement and industry, would belong to one unelected figure, with direct backing from the country's richest men and a private army at his disposal. It was a blueprint for an American version of fascism with a softer face. And then McGuire made the personal pitch. He told Butler that Roosevelt was physically weak, that the strain of office and his illness made him unfit for the crisis, that the country needed a strong man behind the scenes, a man like Butler. In that moment, the mask slipped completely. This was not about rescuing democracy. It was about replacing it with a system where industrialists and bankers ruled through a decorated soldier. They wanted a dictator, but a palatable one. Butler asked who would actually hold the new office. Was it to be him? Was he just the front man while someone else wrote the orders? McGuire's answers were vague on purpose. He hinted that Butler would have enormous influence, that his name and reputation would guarantee him a decisive role. But to a man who had seen how power actually worked in occupied countries and foreign interventions, the pattern was obvious. The money men would rule. The general would be the face. What McGuire and the people behind him did not understand was that Butler had already gone through his own transformation. The same man who once stormed foreign cities for corporate interests was now publicly describing his old role in brutal terms. He had begun calling himself a racketeer for capitalism. He talked about Nicaragua, Haiti, Mexico, as places where he had helped make the world safe for American corporations, not for democracy. He was not going to spend the last years of his life doing the same thing at home. So Butler did what very few in his position would have dared to do. He played along long enough to gather information. He kept asking questions. He let McGuire talk. He noted every time a big name was dropped or hinted at. He watched where the money came from, who signed the checks, which committees and front organizations were suddenly flush with cash for patriotic activities. When McGuire mentioned trips to Europe, Butler paid attention to dates and destinations. When he mentioned arms, Butler thought about which companies could supply them quietly. At some point, Butler brought in someone who could act in the shadows without attracting the same attention. Journalist Paul Comley French. French met with McGuire separately, under the guise of being another interested party or sympathetic contact. In those conversations, McGuire repeated and confirmed the core of the plan. That was critical. It meant Butler was not alone. There was an independent witness who could later say, under oath, that this was not just one man's word. Step by step, what had begun as a strange approach about a speech at a veterans' convention turned into a fully exposed conspiracy. A private army, industrial money, political front groups, a figurehead president, a strong man behind the scenes. The most chilling part of this story is not that a group of businessmen thought about doing it. It is how close they came to having everything they needed. They had money. They had access to weapons. They had organizations they could use as a shell. They had a country in crisis where many people were desperate enough to follow anyone who promised order. The only piece missing was a man with medals on his chest and a reputation that could not be bought. They thought they had found him in Smedley Butler. Instead, they had just recruited the one man in America who could blow the entire operation wide open. By the fall of 1934, Smedley Butler understood two things very clearly. First, there had been a serious attempt by powerful interests to build a private army and pressure the President of the United States into handing over real power. Second, if he went public alone, without witnesses or documents, they would destroy him in the press and bury the story under ridicule. So he did what he had been trained his entire life to do. He built a case. He kept every letter. He wrote down every conversation with Gerald McGuire in detail as soon as the man left the room. Dates, places, exact phrases, promises of money, numbers of men, names hinted at, even if never spoken directly. He knew that if this ever went in front of Congress, the men on the other side would have lawyers, newspapers, and politicians ready to paint him as confused, bitter, or delusional. Facts were his only protection. And he did not stay alone. He brought in Paul Comley French, a reporter from the Philadelphia Record and the New York Evening Post. French met McGuire independently, asked his own questions, and listened as McGuire bragged about huge sums of money, European trips to study fascist movements, and the plan to put someone like a Secretary of General Affairs over Roosevelt. That was decisive. Butler now had a civilian witness who could stand up in a hearing and say, "Yes, this man told me the same thing." With that, Butler moved to the one place where, in theory, truth still had a formal stage: Congress. He reached out to members of the House of Representatives and demanded an investigation. This was not a polite suggestion. Butler had a reputation, and he used it. He told them, in essence, "You can either look into this, or you can take responsibility for ignoring a plot to overthrow the president. There were still enough people in Washington who took that seriously that a special committee was created, the McCormick-Dickstein Committee, an early version of what would later be known as the House Committee on Un-American Activities. On November 20th, 1934, Butler finally spoke under oath. In that hearing room, he laid out the story from beginning to end. How McGuire had approached him, how the proposal had grown from a speech to an army of 500,000 veterans, how millions of dollars in backing had been discussed, how the ultimate goal was to force Roosevelt into accepting a new assistant who would run the country in his name, in a direct echo of how fascist leaders had taken power in Europe. Then came one of the most important moments. Paul calmly French took the stand. French confirmed that he had spoken with McGuire separately, and that McGuire had described essentially the same plan. He testified that McGuire had told him they wanted to create a sort of super secretary in the government, a man who would take over the real functions of the presidency. French also said that McGuire boasted of money raised from conservative backers and of his admiration for how veterans groups in Italy and Germany had been used to support authoritarian regimes. On paper, this should have been a turning point. A decorated general and a working journalist, both under oath, describing a plan that looked very much like an American adaptation of fascism. At minimum, it should have triggered subpoenas, raids on offices, public grilling of the men whose names hovered in the background. Instead, the investigation began to slow down almost as soon as it started. McGuire was called to testify. He denied everything. He claimed that Butler had misunderstood him, that there had been no talk of a coup, no talk of an army, no plan to pressure the president. He admitted to raising money for veterans' causes and to traveling to Europe, but framed it as harmless research and patriotic fundraising. Without a signed document labeled coup d'etat, he gambled that vague denials would be enough, especially if the people behind him stayed completely out of sight. Behind closed doors, the committee members were under enormous pressure. They knew exactly who would be implicated if they followed the money trail. Names tied to huge corporations, national banks, and influential families. People whose donations financed campaigns, whose companies employed tens of thousands of workers, whose credit propped up the very federal government now investigating them. To drag them into open hearings on accusations of plotting a fascist takeover would have been politically explosive. There were risks on every side. If the committee pushed hard and failed to produce a smoking gun, it would hand Roosevelt's enemies a perfect weapon. Proof, they would say, that his supporters were inventing conspiracies to smear honest businessmen. If they pushed and succeeded, they might destabilize the fragile economic recovery by openly declaring war on the same business interests they still needed to cooperate with the New Deal. And if they did nothing, they would be quietly complicit in burying an attempt at treason because it was committed by the wrong class of people. In the end, they chose a fourth option. They did just enough to make sure they could say they had done something. They took testimony from Butler, French, and McGuire. They gathered documents. They asked questions that sounded serious on the record. Then, slowly, they narrowed the scope. They avoided dragging in the most prominent names that hovered at the edges of the story. They did not subpoena every billionaire and industrialist whose shadow fell across the evidence. Instead, they focused on the middleman, the bond salesman, the man who could be left holding the bag, while everyone else stayed invisible. Meanwhile, the big newspapers did their part. The day after Butler's testimony became public, some outlets treated it as a minor curiosity. The New York Times ran the story but buried it deep in the paper, noted his claims, and highlighted McGuire's denials. Other major papers framed the whole thing as fantastic, sensational, and probably exaggerated. They emphasized the lack of dramatic action from the committee as proof that the story was overblown. Only a handful of papers, like the Philadelphia Record, treated it as the bombshell it actually was, giving serious space to Butler's charges and French's corroboration. But regional papers could not set the national narrative. The audience that needed to hear that a senior general had accused Wall Street of plotting a fascist coup was being told instead that this was probably just a misunderstanding. From Butler's point of view, watching this unfold was infuriating. He had done everything by the book. He had gathered evidence. He had found a second witness. He had gone through proper channels, testified under oath, and put his reputation on the line. He fully expected that, at a minimum, the committee would name the men McGuire had hinted at and recommend further action. He thought there would be indictments or at least public hearings that forced these people to explain themselves. What he got instead was a final report that did something both extraordinary and infuriating. The committee quietly acknowledged that there had been a plot. In its written conclusions, it stated that there was evidence that certain persons had made an attempt to establish a fascist organization in this country. It noted that testimony indicated these attempts were discussed, were planned, and might have been put into execution when and if the financial backers deemed it expedient. It did not say Butler had imagined it. It did not dismiss him as a crank. On the core question of whether there had been a conspiracy, the committee effectively said yes. And then it stopped. No powerful backer was named in the report. No major industrialist or banker was indicted. No one went to trial. The language was carefully chosen to confirm that something real and dangerous had been discussed, while avoiding anything that would drag specific, untouchable men into court. The message between the lines was clear. Yes, there was a plan. No, nothing will be done about it. For Butler, this was almost worse than outright denial. It meant the system had seen the threat, admitted it existed, and then decided that the people behind it were simply too important to confront. It meant that in the United States of 1934, if you were rich enough and well-connected enough, you could explore overthrowing the government and walk away without even a public shaming. In the years that followed, the story of the business plot began to fade. It was not taught in schools. It did not become part of the standard narrative of the New Deal. It lived on mostly in the memories of those who had read the original reports and in occasional articles that treated it as a strange footnote to history. Butler did not forget. Until his death in 1940, he continued to talk about the plot in interviews and speeches. He repeated that he had been approached to lead a fascist movement and that the backers had never faced justice. To him, it was not just a story about one conspiracy. It was proof that the real danger to American democracy did not come only from foreign ideologies or street radicals. It came from the boardrooms and private clubs, where men who thought they owned the country were willing to break it rather than share power. The committee's final report closed the official file. but it left a question hanging in the air, one that has never really gone away. If the only thing that stopped a fascist experiment in 1930s America was the conscience of one general and the fear of exposure, what exactly is protecting democracy when the next crisis arrives and the next group of powerful men decide that elections are no longer acceptable to them? When the McCormick-Dickstein Committee quietly closed its file on the business plot, it did not just end an investigation. It began a cover-up by neglect. On paper, Congress had admitted that there were attempts to form a fascist organization in the United States, discussed, planned, and prepared to be launched when financiers decided the time was right. In practice, almost no one outside a narrow circle ever heard about it. No one went to prison. No one lost their fortune. No one was put on trial in front of the American people and forced to answer the simplest question of all. Did you try to overthrow your own government? The men whose money and influence hovered in the background of Butler's testimony went back to their boards, their clubs, and their estates. For them, the plot became exactly what they had hoped it would be if it failed. An embarrassing rumor, something to be laughed off as the fantasy of an aging general. For Smedley Butler, it was not a rumor. It was the last chapter of his life's education. He had entered the Marines as a teenager, believing he was fighting for honor and country. He retired realizing he had often been fighting for oil companies, banks, and sugar interests. He spent his final years warning Americans that he had been, in his own words, a racketeer for capitalism, listing country after country where he had used force to protect corporate investments. When the business plot landed on his doorstep, he recognized the pattern instantly. This was the same game, only now the target was Washington itself. He died in 1940, before America entered World War II, still repeating that there had been a real attempt to build a private army and impose a corporate-controlled dictatorship. He watched the committee admit the plot in writing and then refused to name names. He watched the press minimize or ridicule the story. He watched the people who had tried to use him walk away, untouched. To him, that was the real verdict on how far the law reached when it brushed against the very top of the economic pyramid. The most disturbing part is what happened next. Or rather, what did not happen. The business plot did not become a scandal taught in every textbook as a warning that American democracy had nearly been hijacked. It did not lead to a permanent investigation of how money and power intersected with the military and veterans. It did not inspire new laws preventing corporations or wealthy individuals from funding private armies or paramilitary groups. Instead, it slipped into the shadows, an uncomfortable story filed away under conspiracy theories whenever it surfaced. This silence is not accidental. It serves a purpose. If you admit that some of the richest and most respectable citizens of the country once tried to copy Mussolini and Hitler by building a mass movement of veterans to seize power, you are forced to admit a second thing. You have to admit that the threat to democracy does not only come from the streets, from radicals, from people waving foreign flags. It comes from boardrooms and drawing rooms, from men in suits who see elected governments as obstacles to be removed when they interfere with profit. Look at the larger picture of that era. While Butler was testifying about an attempted fascist plot, major American companies and banks were still doing business with Nazi Germany and other authoritarian regimes. Firms linked to DuPont, General Motors, and others invested in or traded with countries that were openly destroying unions, outlawing opposition parties, and turning the state into a tool of corporate and party power. The same class of people who saw Roosevelt's New Deal as socialism saw no contradiction in working with actual dictators abroad. This is the real context of the business plot. It was not an isolated case of a few eccentrics getting carried away. It was part of a global moment in which conservative elites in multiple countries decided that if democracy meant stronger unions, higher taxes, and regulation of business, then maybe democracy had gone too far. In Italy, they turned to Mussolini. In Germany, they backed Hitler until it was too late. In the United States, some of them tried to create their own version, and they only stopped when they were exposed. So why is this story not at the center of how Americans learn about the 1930s? Because it cuts against the comforting myth that it cannot happen here. It shows that it almost did. It shows that the same ingredients that produced fascism in Europe were present in the United States: economic collapse, mass unemployment, fear of communism, a hated reformist government, and an economic elite willing to gamble on authoritarian solutions. The only real difference is that in America, the plot failed before it could be tested in the streets. And even that failure rests on a fragile foundation. There was no system, no automatic safeguard that detected and crushed the business plot. There was a man, a single individual with enough medals and enough guilt about his past to say no when he was offered money, power, and an army. A man stubborn enough to document everything, drag it into Congress, and keep talking about it until his death, even when the institutions around him clearly wanted the story to disappear. That is not a safety mechanism. That is luck. The uncomfortable lesson of the business plot is this: if the people behind it had chosen a different general, a more ambitious one, a man without Butler's conscience or his late-life clarity, history might have turned out differently. If they had found their American Mussolini, someone willing to stand at the head of 500,000 veterans and claim he was saving the country, there is no guarantee that Congress or the press or the public would have stopped him in time. Which brings us to the present. Every time a crisis hits, every time an economic crash or a pandemic or a wave of unrest shakes the system, the same question quietly returns in private conversations among the powerful. Do we ride this out with elections and compromises, or do we look for a faster, stronger solution? The business plot is the historical proof that in the United States, at least once, some of the richest people answered that question by seriously exploring a coup. You are not supposed to remember that. You are supposed to remember Roosevelt's fireside chats, the alphabet agencies, the victory in World War II. You are supposed to remember the story of a system that bent but never broke. The fact that it nearly snapped in 1934 under the pressure of men who thought they owned the country does not fit that narrative. But the documents exist. The testimony exists. The committee's own admission exists. Together, they point to a single, unavoidable conclusion. Yes, there was a business plot. Yes, it was real enough that Congress confirmed attempts to build a fascist organization. Yes, the men behind it faced no real consequences. And yes, the only reason it failed was that the one person they needed most turned out not to be for sale. The question this leaves for the viewer is simple and deeply unsettling. If the same situation returns, if another crisis convinces a new generation of powerful men that democracy is bad for business, will there be another Smedley Butler ready to say no? Or will the next plot, smoother, better hidden, and backed by even more money and influence, succeed where the first one failed.